Hello and welcome to our first event of our Exchanges programme. It's our hybrid programme of free events, talks, seminars and training sessions, a space to share knowledge and to gain insight, allowing change makers within our network to connect and grow alongside each other. Just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded to allow us to share with those who can't make it today. A big thank you to Andrea, whose work has taken the lead on this project, and also to Jason and Kat, who've worked so hard to get these events off the ground. Our first guest is Anna Richards. Anna is a writer and travel consultant from Cornwall, who's been researching how we can start traveling in a more sustainable way and writes about her travels in a number of publications. Anna also has the dubious honour of having her beloved Cornwall taken over by the G7 meeting recently, and I'm sure she'll be sharing her views of how that went too. Please feel free to ask any questions via the Q&A icon, and at the end of the talk, Anna will answer as many as she can. She's also kindly offered to answer any other ones via email later on. Also at the end of the session, we'll be opening up so we can hear your ideas and ask questions in person. If you have any technical issues, I'd like to introduce you to Jason, our IT manager.
Hi, yeah, you can text or call me on 078 9999 1234 if you've got any troubles during the webinar.
Thank you, Jason. And now I'd like to hand you over to Anna.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for joining me on an exceptionally sunny afternoon to discuss how we can look at travelling in a more sustainable way in a post-COVID world. As Deborah said, I am a freelance travel writer and travel consultant. I've been working in travel for about 5 years now. I'd like to apologise in advance for my lack of technical skills. I'm keeping fingers crossed that all goes well with my presentation, but I am the sort of person that only needs to touch a computer for it to break. So please do bear with me if anything goes wrong at all. I live in Cornwall in a place called Falmouth, which has played host to the media for the G7 this weekend. So the town has been incredibly busy. Lots of protests have been taking place. So a lot of environmental action protests, but lots of other things besides. And I actually met Andrea camping on a beach near St. Ives last summer. I was doing a zero waste through hike. And I think that we bonded over both taking beeswax wraps with us, but it's great to now be a part of this webinar organised by Andrea. So as Deborah said, there is going to be a chance for a Q&A at the end. What I would like to caveat is that, I think sustainable travel is a fairly new concept. It's something that is relatively new to me as well. I definitely don't have all of the answers on how we can travel more sustainably. So as well as it being an opportunity for all of you to ask questions, I'd really welcome your ideas as well. I think that it would be nice to get as much of a discussion going as possible. So travel is something that we all really enjoy, and something that I'd imagine that most of us have really missed, something that we're very keen to get back to after, being effectively grounded for the last 16 months. I feel as though, I'm even starting to dream about hot air hitting you as you get off an aeroplane, or the excitement of wandering around somewhere as mundane as just a supermarket in another country. And there's a famous quote that says that travel is the only thing that we can buy that makes us richer. And in terms of the experiences that it offers, I couldn't agree more. The problem is, and it's probably something that we weren't particularly conscious of even as recently as about 10 years ago, is that travel can be incredibly damaging to the environment. So we're all here because we love traveling and we care about the planet. So what I want to explore today is how we can consolidate the two. Now, I've put together a few poll options because, as I said, I want this webinar to be as interactive as possible, and I'd like to know a bit more about your travel options. What I was hoping to do is sort of launch the polls one by one, but that appears to be outside of my technical abilities. So I'm going to share the polls with you all now. There's 8 polls, and if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment to answer these, that would be absolutely fantastic. So that should all be shared with you now. And just to go through what we're going to be discussing today, I want to look at how COVID-19 has changed the landscape of travel. I'm also going to be looking at long-haul travel, short-haul travel, and travel for business. So I'll just give you all a moment longer to vote in the polls, but getting the answers in, it looks as though a lot of people are voting in similar ways, which is to be expected. So the first question that I asked was, who here is excited about traveling again? And it looks as though 83% of you are excited about traveling again, which is not at all surprising. And the next thing that I was looking at was how many of you have been on a plane. And it looks as though overwhelmingly 100% of you have traveled on a plane before, which is what I would expect as well. But actually, having traveled on a plane before already sets you apart from 90% of the world population. Only 1 in 10 people worldwide has ever been on a plane. So I think that the first thing that we have to recognize when we're talking about sustainable travel is that travel is a privilege rather than a right. And it's a privilege that all of us have taken advantage of. So everybody here has been on a plane. I then asked who'd ever flown long haul. 92% of you have flown long haul. 100% of you have flown short haul. And 62% of you have flown domestically. So we're talking about the overwhelming majority of us who have flown long haul, short haul, and domestically, and all of us have been on a plane. I'm no different to all of you, essentially. And I'm probably actually much worse because I've traveled a great deal in my comparatively short life. Working in travel means that it does go hand in hand with the job. And until recently, probably as recently as a couple of years ago, I thought nothing of hopping on flight after flight. Growing up, we'd usually have a family holiday in Europe each year, often France, but sometimes Italy or Austria. And sometimes we get the passenger ferry across the channel and hire a car and drive, but more often than not, we would fly. And then when I went to university, I opted to study languages, which came with a year abroad. And I can't lie, it was probably my main reason for choosing the degree that I did, was that I was desperate to explore. So I spent half the year in France and half the year in Argentina. And after finishing work in Argentina, I traveled at breakneck speed and in a thoroughly unsustainable way up through Latin America. After university, I alternated bartending and backpacking until I began working in luxury travel. And all of a sudden, I was getting paid to travel to the other side of the world. And working for a company where everyone was always going somewhere exciting made me almost competitive with my holidays. So if I had a long weekend or a few days of annual leave, I'd cram in a mini break and fly off to somewhere like the Faroe Islands and do a few days of trekking. And staying local wouldn't have even crossed my mind. I first heard of Extinction Rebellion around about 3 to 4 years ago, and I was probably late to the party. Obviously, climate change was already very much on my radar, but I perhaps hadn't realized quite how dire a situation we were in. So I started making some changes to my lifestyle and I started cycling to work. I always carried a reusable coffee cup and a reusable water bottle. I gave up meat. But the one thing that didn't change was my insatiable desire to see as much of the world as possible. So what I'm saying is, I've probably been a much worse offender than many of you, and I don't have all of the answers on how we can travel more sustainably. But I do want to explore how we can consolidate being environmentalists with our love of travel. When the pandemic hit, I was in South America again, and I'd been out there for 5 months when restrictions started to be put in place, COVID rates were accelerating, and I felt compelled to return home. I was already traveling in a very different way to my first visit when I was at university, but of course I'd still flown to get out there. And I actually ended up having to take multiple flights to get home. Over the last 16 months, my only adventures have been local, mostly in Cornwall, which is where I live. And it's given me the chance to sit back and reflect on the way that I travel. So today I'm going to explore a few of my findings with you, and we'll look at long haul and short haul trips and how we can all be more sustainable, mindful, and conscientious travelers going forwards. So I asked a few other things in the polls about your traveling habits. And I asked you all if you felt as though travel or the experiences that you've had traveling have enriched your life. And 100% of you answered that yes, you felt that they had. I also asked if you had family and or friends who live in another country. 77% of you do. And finally, I asked if you would be willing to permanently give up foreign travel. Only 15% of you would be willing to give up foreign travel permanently. So I think that what we're seeing here is that travel, although it can be damaging, it brings enormous benefits. And I'm not going to sit here and preach to you and say, never go and visit your mum who lives in Australia, or, never go and study abroad to learn a new language, or never feel the sheer joy and wonder of immersing yourself in a culture and language that seem completely alien to you, because that's not the way that I want to live. And I'm sure it's not the way that you want to live either. But I would like you to remember that figure from the start, that only 1/10 of the world population has ever been on a plane. So now to give you another figure, aviation alone counts for 2.5% of global emissions. So if the other 9/10 of the world population start flying at the same rate as the 1/10 that already do, and why shouldn't they? Suddenly aviation has shot up to account for 1/4 of all global emissions. So first of all, staying topical, let's look at how COVID-19 has impacted the way that we travel. We've moved into a second summer of ever-changing travel restrictions and a confusing traffic light system where we're told that legally we can visit certain places, but morally, can we justify it? And let me tell you, working for a travel company can be an absolute nightmare with these changing restrictions. Portugal goes on the green list. There's a mad flurry of demand as people scramble to get away. And just weeks later, it gets put on the amber list and everyone rushes to get home again. Then you throw in PCR testing before and after the trip at an added expense. And I'm not going to sit here and discuss whether it's wrong or right to travel at the moment, because that's not the purpose of this webinar today. But I do want to talk about how COVID-19 has changed the landscape of travel. When the pandemic first hit, the world breathed and CO2 emissions globally dropped by 6.4%. But actually, this was less than leading scientists had predicted, and it still wasn't a large enough drop. Also, we're already seeing that start to bounce back. And the concern is it going to come back worse? A huge part of that drop in emissions was because we weren't traveling. Far fewer flights were running, but equally we weren't commuting. There were far fewer cars on the road. On the flip side, COVID-19 has meant that we've taken big steps backwards in single-use plastic. Lots of coffee shops won't fill your reusable cup anymore. PPE is disposable, and suddenly we're finding disposable face masks everywhere. 2 weeks ago, I went on a river cleaning trip near here with a company called Clean Ocean Sailing that operates river and sea cleaning trips around Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. And they log everything that they pull out of the water. And they've had to add a whole new category into their logbook for PPE because they're finding so much of it. So as travel bounces back, are we all going to take the same amount of trips, or perhaps even more trips as we did before? But are we also going to be doing this and also creating a lot more waste in the form of single-use plastics? Let's hope not, because we simply can't afford to do so. If there is one thing that I can say about the past 16 months, it is that I have had time to think about the way that I travel and the way that I will travel going forwards. I'd also like to stress that whilst individual actions are important, systemic change is much more impactful than individual actions, not that that takes the onus off us as individuals. So since we're already talking about flights, it makes sense to start with the worst offender, so long-haul travel and flying. We're often told, go and visit all of these beautiful places before they're gone for good. Venice is sinking. The Maldives will be underwater in 100 years. Go to the Arctic Circle to see the ice caps before they melt. But are we buying into the problem here? At the moment, there is no viable way to fly in a green way. Electric planes don't look as though they're going to arrive anytime soon. The battery is simply too heavy to get them off the ground. A lot of airlines are starting to use biofuels, and whilst direct emissions from biofuels are lower than fossil fuels, the making and transporting of biofuels can come at a really high environmental cost. So what can we do? Sadly, for the time being at least, we need to look at reducing the amount that we fly, and it's as simple as that. Is there an alternative? Sometimes there isn't. You know, if you're going to go to New Zealand, for example, you're probably going to have to fly to get there. If you're going somewhere like that, make sure that you're going for as long as you possibly can to make it worth it. If you can, take a direct flight rather than indirect flight. Taking off and landing pump a lot more CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. So it's well worth investing a little bit extra to fly direct if you can, and fly in economy class. The average business class flight has a 3 times higher carbon footprint than that of an economy class flight. On that, pack lightly. Each extra kilo of weight that you take uses more emissions. So think about, you know, if you really need to fly business class and take 40 kilos of luggage with you, you probably don't need to. And, you know, the more that you take, the more CO2 you're pumping into the atmosphere, basically. But have a little look at this, this graph, and I will be sending around this presentation after the webinar as well. But you can see here just what high offenders business and first class flights are. So what can we do? We can offset our carbon. And this is something that's come under a lot of criticism, because if you catch 50 flights a year and you simply offset your carbon, it's not really doing anything. You can't take carbon released into the atmosphere out again just with a click or by planting a tree. A tree takes years to grow, and it can take a newly planted tree 20 years to capture the amount of carbon that a carbon offsetting scheme promises. Carbon offsetting is not a solution, and it shouldn't be used to justify increased flying. But I would still say that it is good to get into the habit of offsetting carbon when you fly. You can also use flight comparison sites like FlyGreen, which will choose ways to offset flights for you. So one statistic that shocked me rather was that a return flight from London to New York produces 986 kilograms of CO2. And this is the equivalent of leaving your phone charger plugged in at the wall for 20 years. So we are really talking about a massive offender here as well. So if you can choose an alternative to flying, please do it. Look at traveling by ferry, by train, by bus, in a car share. Make the journey a part of the experience if you can and if you have time. Is a cruise a viable alternative? In a nutshell, no. It's a worse offender than flying. Cruise ships emit up to 4 times as much CO2 per passenger as flying does. So when you've got to your destination, it's your responsibility to make sure that your money is going to the right people and to the right companies. Are you booking a package tour? If so, I would really recommend using a site, for example, responsibletravel.com, to choose a reputable tour operator. There is an abundance of information on the internet at the moment. So I think it's all about doing your research. So I wouldn't expect just arrive in a destination, book onto the first tour that you see, or, do a quick Google search, click on the first company that you see and, book with them without checking any of their credentials. I think that at the moment, it really pays to do your homework. There's quite a few warning signs that a tour operator isn't reputable. And some of those warning signs are things like a tour operator selling orphanage tours or school visits. You know, I can't imagine anybody coming down to Cornwall on holiday, for example, and wanting to go around a local primary school. It just wouldn't happen. So why would we do that when we go abroad? Promoting unethical wildlife experiences is another huge thing. And I think that this is something that's come under a lot of scrutiny and fortunately isn't happening nearly as much now as it did perhaps 10 years ago. But I remember when I started university and I joined with a lot of people who had done a classic gap year backpacking route around Southeast Asia. And I remember, you know, adding new friends on Facebook because that's what we were all using back then. And so many of them had profile pictures where they were posing next to a drugged up tiger. We have so much more awareness now. Tour operators should not be selling or promoting experiences like that, but sadly, some of them do. So elephant riding, elephant bathing, things like that are warning signs that a tour operator is not as ethical as they say. Another huge thing is using local guides and locally owned hotels. When you're going to a place, you want to make sure that your money is going back into the local economy, not going into the pocket of some fat cat on the other side of the world. So have a look at the sort of hotels and the sort of experiences that a company's offering. Are they offering just, you know, great big multinational chain hotels, or are they offering the immersive experiences that are actually going to give back to the local community? It's so easy to get information these days. If you're not sure about a company, Google them, check the reviews, check their website for any initiatives that they have to give back to the community. And if it doesn't say anything, don't be afraid to question them. If they can't give you an answer, that's probably enough of an answer for you. And when you're in country, immerse yourself. Eat locally, buy locally, learn from local people, make sure that your trip counts. Think about how you're getting around in country. Do you need to take domestic flights? Do you need to do a whistle-stop tour and see an entire country in a 2-week trip? You can often find that you're going to get much more off the beaten track and have much more unique experiences if you concentrate on one part of the country. So if you're going to India, instead of trying to, you know, go and visit the Golden Triangle, go down to Kerala and go over to, say, the Andaman Islands and Mumbai and up to the Himalayan foothills, why not think about which part appeals most to you? Try not to use domestic flights when you're out there and travel at a slower speed. You won't lose half your holiday then to traveling around, and you'll probably find some little places that are much more off the beaten track. Do be aware of greenwashing with companies as well. So agencies and properties will often try to portray themselves as ethical, and they're not always as ethical as they claim to be. Essentially, they'll try to portray themselves as eco because it makes them more money, and it's pretty fashionable at the moment as well. But serving food on a banana leaf, for example, doesn't mean that your meal hasn't been shipped from hundreds of miles away. So just be a little bit aware of that. So moving on to short haul travel, I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but this last year for me has really felt like the year of the micro adventure. And I've discovered so much more of my local area than ever before. And I mean, I'm very fortunate that I live somewhere that's as gorgeous as Cornwall, but we have got an abundance of spectacular scenery in the UK that we perhaps don't take advantage of enough. So over the last year, when we haven't been in lockdown, I have been experimenting with doing zero waste through hikes. And I've also been doing paddleboarding trips where I do river cleans and sea cleans, and basically challenging myself to see if I can go on multi-day adventures, but going one step further than leaving no trace, actually having zero impact as I go. So when we're having UK-based adventures, what do we need to remember? In this section, I'm going to go through a bit of an idea on of what to pack, good ideas for meals for a multi-day adventure in the UK, and sort of how to get around. So I would really recommend avoiding domestic flights. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, there are very few places in the UK that warrant taking a domestic flight. So take public transport if you can to get to your destination. Or if you are going to drive, why not offer up spaces in your car on a lift sharing site like BlaBlaCar? Unfortunately, BlaBlaCar hasn't taken off nearly as much in the UK as it has in a lot of other countries around the world. But there are also local lift sharing groups, which often have a lot more participants, which is worth looking up. So, for example, down here in Cornwall and in the West Country, we have an application, a Facebook group called the Pasty Connection, which works the exact same way as BlaBlaCar, but tends to have a bit of a higher uptake. And I remember that when I was in university in Nottingham, we had a group called the Robin Hood Connection. And it's a great way of getting around. I've met some fantastic people on car shares. You reduce the cost of the fuel, and you're producing less CO2 emissions as you go, basically. So when we're packing for through hiking, for bike packing trips, for just sort of a camping adventure with friends, what should we take? Remember, the most sustainable gear or clothing that you have is what you already own. So where you can, look at repairing and reusing the gear that you've got. You've also got loads of sites that sell secondhand gear for hiking, for camping, and for outdoor adventures. There's one really good one called Outdoors Geek, but you can also get loads of secondhand gear on Depop, on Facebook Marketplace, on eBay, on Gumtree. There's so much out there. What I have done at the end of this presentation as well, I have put together a list of resources, so a bit of recommended reading, but also sites that you might find helpful when planning and packing for zero waste or low impact adventures. Occasionally, of course, you might need to buy something new. So if you are buying something new, try to look for outdoor brands with good credentials. Something that really shocked me is that lots of down sleeping bags and jackets, for example, are still the result of live plucking. So have a look at the brand that you're buying from. There's outdoors brands like Patagonia and like Finisterre, for example, that are committed to producing environmentally friendly, sustainable clothing and gear. They do tend to come with a higher price tag, but they should last a lot longer. So if you are having to buy something new rather than secondhand, consider investing in a brand that does have more ethical credentials. When you're doing a zero waste through hike, I've put together a bit of a list of things that can be really helpful to take with you. And this has all been a bit of a case of trial and error for me. The first time that I tried to go on a zero waste through hike, I sourced a lot of my food from my local zero waste shop, and I left some of it in brown paper bags. Which was incredibly stupid. And for breakfast, I was eating porridge from oats that I picked out of the rather fluffy lining of my bag. Obviously, you eat it when you're on the trail, you're hungry, everything tastes great, but it wasn't fantastic, and I wouldn't really recommend doing that. So think about how you're going to store what you take. Beeswax wraps, absolutely fantastic for storing food. Tupperwares are a really good shout as well. Canvas bags I found to be really, really good. You can wash them out really easily. So canvas bags are great for storing dry foods and your grains. So, your oats, your couscous, things like that. A reusable drinks bottle is absolutely invaluable. If you can get one with inbuilt filtration, that's absolutely great, especially when you're hiking around in the UK. Another thing that I find really helpful is Castile soap. So Castile soap can be used on your body, but it can also be used for washing pans. And basically you can wash out pans, or you can wash in the river and the sea, and Castile soap is not damaging, basically, to put into a fresh water or a saltwater source. So the other bonus with this is, when we're looking at doing particularly sort of a hike or a bike packing trip, you ideally want to keep the weight of your bag as low as possible. So by taking Castile soap that you can use for your body and use for washing pans, you're also reducing the weight of your pack. Toothpaste, if you spit it into the undergrowth, it can actually be quite damaging to sort of flora and fauna. The fluoride in it can be really damaging to plants. So a natural tooth powder is a really good shout as well, and you can get it in sort of a paste, or you can get it in sort of powder form, and decant it into little pots. So again, probably lighter than taking a whole tube of toothpaste. I have found that it tastes very strongly of bicarb, but it definitely makes your teeth feel really clean. So worth looking at if you're going on a through hike. A trowel for burying your business, absolutely essential. And do remember to bag up anything, any toilet paper that you use, and take it back with you. No one wants to find that on the trail. And that should always go without saying as well. If you're practicing leave no trace, which is what we should all be doing in the outdoors. Another thing that I think is really, really helpful for anybody who menstruates is a menstrual cup. It's much lighter than taking sanitary products on the trail with you. You're not going to have to take a big bag of waste back with you. And the great thing is, with a menstrual cup, you can just rinse it out with clean drinking water as you're going along on the trail, and then boil it at the end of the hike. And yeah, that's all you need to take, basically. So much lighter. When we are looking at what meals to take, there's quite a few things that you want to consider when you're doing a through hike or, quite an active local adventure. And that is the weight of your pack, taking food that is filling, but is also nutritious, and lightweight as well. So I've put together a few meal ideas that have worked really well for me. One of the resources that I've put at the end of this presentation is a site called Veggie Vagabonds, which has got a lot of links to vegan and zero waste camping meals, hiking meals, really delicious recipes, a lot of which are probably a bit beyond my capabilities, but they're really worth looking up because they do a free newsletter, and yeah, loads of different resources there. But here's a few things that I've implemented basically when I've been doing zero waste through hikes. When I was reflecting back at the through hiking that I'd done in the past, I realized just how much waste it came with. And how many single-use plastics I was using. I think that it's quite common for people to pre-package meals in individual Ziploc bags to get the portion sizes right, for example, or to take dehydrated hiking meals, for example, in packets that just have to go in the bin at the end and can't be recycled, or things like individually wrapped energy bars. But as I've discovered, it doesn't have to be that way. And I know that there's a temptation to pre-portion out your food and measure all into little bags. But actually, once you've kind of measured what you need for, say, 3 or 4 meals and put it in a Tupperware, you can gauge a really good idea of how much of that you can have for each meal. So really, when you're planning for these adventures, again, preparation is key, the same as it is for long haul travel when you're deciding which excursions to book onto, which hotels to stay with, which tour operators to go with. If you haven't done zero waste adventures before, then you are going to need to prepare. So have a little think about where you're getting your food from. Are there places that you can restock on the way? What I'd recommend initially is setting yourself a challenge to see if you can do a 2-day, 1-night hiking and camping trip, but do it entirely zero waste. And it's actually really good fun to, set yourself a challenge like that. It adds a whole other element into your adventure. And it's something that becomes so much easier with practice. And it's just a good exercise to make you sort of wake up and think about how much waste you would usually accumulate on a hiking or camping trip. So when you're sourcing your food, look to see if there is a zero waste shop near you. There's a lot spring up all over the UK now, so a quick internet search will throw up if there's any in your local area. But then you often find that smaller health food shops as well will have a zero waste section. Local markets are a really good shout as well. And you can also look at foraging locally as well. This is something that I have tried with probably fairly limited success in Cornwall when I've been hiking around. But if you do a little bit of research, there are things that you can forage locally, and that can be great fun as well and enormously satisfying to do as you're hiking around. If you're not used to foraging, I wouldn't rely on it for your meals. You're likely to get quite hungry and quite grumpy on the trail, but it's a good thing to try and give a go to. So do give it a go. I hope these meal ideas are useful, and I'd really love to hear how you all get on if you do choose to try and do some zero waste adventures. Here are a couple of pieces that I've written with some recommended sort of walking routes in Cornwall if any of you are coming down over the summer, which I'd imagine a lot of people are, because it seems as though most people are coming down to Cornwall at the moment, and also a bit of a guideline on how to hike zero waste and cut out single-use plastic and waste on the trail. Finally, since I'm talking to tenants, shareholders and staff of ethical property, and you work for a variety of different charities, but I'd imagine that sometimes some of you travel or get the opportunity to travel for work, I'd like to explore if business travel is really necessary. And I'm not saying that if your work is offering to pay for you to go somewhere really exciting for a conference that you think is going to be hugely beneficial, but it requires a flight to get there. I'm not saying that you should automatically say no to that, but we do have to look at how much we are traveling for work and how much of that is really necessary and how we're doing that traveling as well. I think that inter-office travel pre-COVID was an absolute norm. Do we have to fly somewhere for a face-to-face meeting? Over the last 16 months, the vast majority of us have been obliged to learn to work from home and rely on technology. And Zoom meetings and teamwork meetings work really, really well. And I'm able to give you all this talk today from the comfort of my home in Cornwall. So what we need to look at considering is, do we need to fly to another office? If we're going, do we need to fly business class? Probably not. Can we limit our inter-office travel, making it the exception rather than the rule? Talk about it with your colleagues. Make how we travel a discussion. I am convinced that we're not going to stop traveling. Humans have been traveling since the beginning of our existence. I think that what we just need to do is challenge ourselves, open our minds to new ways of traveling, and armed with new knowledge, keep learning, keep reading, stay curious, and basically challenge yourselves to do better and travel better going forward. So I've put together sort of a few resources here, and again, by no means a definitive list. As I said, this is something that, is fairly new to me. Sustainable travel is something that I've only sort of started to research and read about in the past couple of years. But here's a couple of books that I found really interesting and really helpful. My personal favorite over this past year has been John Wright, The Forager's Calendar, which has got a really helpful sort of illustrated guide to how to forage seasonally in the UK. And yeah, as I said, really, really great thing and really fun thing to kind of incorporate into your micro adventures. There's loads and loads of resources online as well, and again, not at a definitive list at all, but here are a few websites that I use and environmental activists and climate justice activists that I follow. So these are also the Instagram tags of the environmental activists that I follow. Really worth looking up. They're all quite different, but they've all got some fantastic things to say. So I would really recommend looking them up as well. So now I'd like to invite all of you to ask any questions, which I will do my very best to answer, and also to share any ideas that you might have on how we can travel more sustainably in a post-COVID world.
So if anybody wants to take part, if you could just raise your hand by pressing the button, we can try and let you into the conversation. We did have one question, Anna, and that is how environmental and how ethical are Airbnbs, and is there an alternative to the Airbnb?
Airbnbs, do you know, that's an interesting question, and as a company I don't know whether Airbnb is ethical or not. So I would imagine that it depends very much on the individual property. I suppose one issue that I see with Airbnb specifically in Cornwall is that a lot of people buy up properties as second homes, which is pricing the locals out, raising house prices enormously, and turning certain towns into absolute ghost towns during the winter season. So that probably is something to be aware of when you're staying in a self-catered property. I think that, you know, if you're staying in sort of a little kind of annex or a shepherd's hut that's attached to somebody's property, that's perhaps not going to be such a big issue. But do be aware that a lot of Airbnbs, you know, especially if you're hiring out an Airbnb in Cornwall where your host is clearly based in, say, London, it's quite possibly going to be a second home that stands empty for a lot of the year. So if you can look at staying in a hotel or a B&B or a campsite that's locally owned and locally run, then, you know, there's a much higher chance that your money is going to be going back into the local community.
Thank you, Anna. And just to let you know, Carol sent a lovely message saying how interesting and thought-provoking she thought your presentation was.
Thank you very much, Carol. That's really kind.
We do have another question that's come in earlier as well about travelling on ferries. And are they, if you were going over to Europe, would a ferry or the Eurostar be the best option?
Oh, I don't actually know. I think it can be very difficult to exactly rank forms of transport, you know, as to which is best in terms of CO2 emissions per passenger, because I think that it's going to depend a lot on the specific ferry that you get, or the train that you're getting as well. So a lot of railway lines are becoming electric, and as a general rule, the train tends to be the greenest way that you can travel after sort of things like walking, cycling, sailing, for example. So particularly if you're living in London, I would say that getting the Eurostar over to Europe is likely to be your best option. For people like myself that are coming up from the West Country, we have ferry links that go from Plymouth over to France. So if you're factoring in that, you know, you'd have to get all the way up to London and then get the Eurostar and then cross over to Europe, quite possibly it wouldn't be as good an option. But as a general rule, trains tend to be better than other forms of public transport.
Thank you. And we've had another question that's actually just come in via Teams for some reason, and they've said, where can I find information, or do you have any recommendations for my child's gap year?
Your child's gap year? Well, it probably depends a lot on where they are looking at traveling to. Now, I think that budget travel is a really interesting one. And personally, when I travel, I love the kind of the gap year style budget traveling, where you go and you stay in hostels and, you know, you stay in little local accommodation. And I think that actually budget travel can be much more immersive than, you know, sort of high-end luxury holidays. But one thing that I know that I did when I was first starting sort of traveling, and when I sort of went on my year abroad from university, was that I would look at the cheapest flight options, which were often indirect. So I suppose my recommendations for your child's gap year would be for them to really think about which parts of the world they want to visit. I think that, there was a bit of a tendency to try and do a grand round the world tour on a gap year. Not only is that much more expensive, but you're hopping on and off flights the whole time. There's probably going to be numerous indirect flights in there. And basically, the slower you travel, the cheaper it is. When I was in South America, sort of up until last March, when the pandemic hit, I was traveling really, really slowly, and I was having incredible experiences. I wasn't having to sort of stint myself too much, or, say, oh gosh, I can't do that. That's too unaffordable. And I was finding that actually I was spending less than on my first trip to South America, where I traveled really quickly. Because if you are traveling really quickly and you're hopping on and off flights the whole time, and, you're sort of going through all of these enormous sites in a tick box fashion, inevitably, you're going to spend a lot more. So I would probably encourage your child to look at a specific part of the world they want to travel to, be it, Southeast Asia, be it Australasia, be it, South America, and just look at traveling slowly around that area, because it's going to be cheaper, and I think also probably a lot more rewarding.
Thank you, Anna. And we just had a question come through on the Q&A saying, any recommendations for the Lake District?
Not many, to be honest. I've been to the Lake District a handful of times in my life, and I've absolutely loved it, but it's not an area that I know particularly well. It's an area that I'd like to discover much more. I'm afraid I've been incredibly insular over the last 16 months. That even when lockdown has eased, I've largely spent my time in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. I can remember staying in a place called Blencathra in the Lake District. I think it was in the northern part of the Lake District, which was absolutely beautiful. And hiking up Helvellyn was lovely, but I'm by no means an authority on the Lake District, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I think that's the end of our questions. Thank you so much, Anna. And I understand you're going to send some details out and a copy of the presentation for everybody as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely do that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on our very first event. We have another event next month, and it's one that I think is on most people's minds, or a lot of people's minds, over the pandemic, and that is how to deal with anxiety. And we'll be sending out some more information about that very shortly. But thank you again for joining us, and a big thank you to Anna, Andrea, Kat and Jason for putting all of this together.